In a bustling police precinct, the air buzzed with activity as officers exchanged reports, phones rang incessantly, and the occasional laughter punctuated the hum of voices. Among them, Officer Randall stood out, a middle-aged man with a decorated uniform, an air of confidence, and an edge that made even his colleagues tread lightly around him. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. As he recounted a traffic stop from earlier that day, his voice carried a mix of pride and disdain. "Kid couldn't even look me in the eye," Randall said, smirking. "Knew he was guilty of something the moment I saw him." His colleagues chuckled, some nervously, others wholeheartedly, as if his words were part of a long-standing script they all knew too well. The precinct, a microcosm of the city's broader dynamics, often blurred the line between camaraderie and complicity. Later that evening, Randall sat at the head of his family dinner table, cutting into his steak with mechanical precision. The glow of the chandelier above cast sharp shadows on his face, accentuating the deep lines etched by years of authority and belief in his own righteousness. His teenage daughter, Olivia, sat across from him, poking at her food. "You ever think," she began, her voice cautious, "that maybe some people get treated unfairly? Just because of, how they look?" Randall looked up, fork suspended mid-air. His expression hardened. "Unfairly? Let me tell you something, Liv. People get what they deserve. Always have, always will." Olivia's gaze dropped to her plate, but the unspoken challenge lingered in the air like static electricity. Across town, in a grand courtroom lined with oak paneling, Judge Elijah Thompson prepared for another day. His chambers were a haven of quiet dignity, a stark contrast to the chaos outside. A pile of case files sat neatly stacked on his desk, the top one open to reveal a docket of minor infractions, each name and charge painting a picture of systemic inequities. Thompson leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in thought. His clerk, a sharp-eyed young woman named Maria, entered with a fresh batch of paperwork. "Looks like the Jamal Harris case is gaining traction," she said, setting a news clipping on his desk. "It's going to be a tough one." Elijah glanced at the article, which featured a photo of Jamal, a young black activist known for organizing peaceful protests. His eyes lingered on the headline, "Activist or Agitator? Police Arrest Prominent Youth Leader." He sighed. Every case is tough when the court of public opinion has already made its judgment. That night, Thompson returned home to his modest but cozy house. His wife, Cynthia, greeted him with a warm smile and a steaming cup of tea. They sat together on the couch, the day's stress melting away in the comfort of shared silence. "They've assigned me the Jamal Harris case," he said after a while. Cynthia raised an eyebrow. "The one the news is all over?" "Same one. And it's already a circus." He took a sip of tea and leaned back. "But I'll do what I always do, follow the law." Meanwhile, in a dimly lit diner on the city's outskirts, a group of locals gathered over coffee and pie. The conversation inevitably turned to Judge Thompson. "That man doesn't belong on the bench," one older man grumbled. "How can someone like him understand what's best for the rest of us?" The waitress, wiping down a nearby table, paused for a moment, then moved on, her lips pressed into a thin line. The city was full of whispers like this, an undercurrent of resentment that rippled through every corner. The paths of Randall and Thompson crossed briefly the next day in the courthouse lobby. Randall was there to finalize paperwork for a separate case when he spotted Thompson walking by, his robe flowing behind him. Their eyes met, Randall's cold and assessing, Thompson's steady and unyielding. Neither spoke, but the weight of the exchange lingered long after they passed each other. In a small park not far from the courthouse, Jamal Harris stood in front of a small crowd, his voice strong and passionate despite the day's chill. "We don't want handouts. We don't want pity. We want justice, plain and simple." Applause erupted as he finished speaking, but in the shadows, Randall watched from his patrol car, his jaw clenched. To him, Jamal wasn't a leader. He was a problem waiting to be solved. That evening, as the city's lights flickered against the encroaching darkness, a sense of inevitability settled over its streets. The morning sun broke through the cracks of the blinds in Randall's precinct office. The city seemed unusually quiet, almost holding its breath, as Randall sat at his desk, reviewing his latest case. The surveillance photo of Jamal Harris stared back at him. He didn't see an activist or a community leader. To Randall, Jamal was a symbol of defiance, a spark threatening to ignite a fire. "We've got to act before this kid becomes a hero," he muttered, tapping the photo with his pen. His partner, Officer McNeil, raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Later that day, Randall and his team executed a raid on the community center where Jamal and his friends often gathered. It was meant to be a peaceful place, a hub for organizing food drives, tutoring programs, and peaceful protests. But when the officers stormed in, the atmosphere turned chaotic. Tables were overturned, papers scattered, and frightened volunteers were shoved against walls. Jamal, who had been leading a planning meeting, was thrown to the ground, his hands forced behind his back as Randall barked orders. "What is this?" Jamal shouted, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. "We haven't done anything wrong." Randall smirked. "Drug paraphernalia in plain sight. Guess you're not as clean as you pretend to be." Jamal's protests were drowned out as he was dragged out of the center, handcuffs biting into his wrists. Onlookers gathered outside, their faces a mix of anger and despair. Jamal's mother, Martha, arrived just as the squad car pulled away. She screamed his name, pounding on the hood of the car, but Randall didn't even flinch. News of the arrest spread like wildfire. By evening, local stations were running headlines: "Activist leader arrested. Drugs found in raid." The narrative was clear, painting Jamal as a hypocrite, a criminal masquerading as a community savior. Randall, watching the broadcast from the precinct break room, leaned back in his chair, smug satisfaction etched across his face. Across town, Judge Thompson sat in his chambers, the case file on Jamal Harris opened before him. He studied the evidence presented by the police: a bag of heroin supposedly found in Jamal's backpack, photos of the community center raid, and witness statements from officers. Something didn't sit right with him. The evidence felt too convenient, too perfectly damning. Maria, his clerk, knocked lightly before entering. "Sir, you've been assigned the Harris case." Thompson nodded without looking up. "I know. The file's already here." She hesitated. "The media's all over it. They're calling him the face of hypocrisy." Thompson finally looked up, his gaze steady. "Justice isn't determined by the media. It's determined by facts. And I don't like the look of these." Meanwhile, outside the courthouse, the community erupted in outrage. Protesters gathered with signs reading "Justice for Jamal" and "Stop Police Corruption." The air buzzed with chants and the sound of drumbeats. Martha Harris stood at the forefront, her voice cracking as she addressed the crowd. "They took my son because he's brave enough to stand up for what's right. But we won't stop fighting until the truth comes out." That night, Randall attended a gathering at a bar frequented by his fellow officers. They toasted to keeping the streets clean, their laughter loud and boisterous. McNeil, however, sat quietly in the corner, nursing his drink. When Randall joined him, McNeil leaned in and whispered, "That raid, something about it doesn't feel right." Randall's jovial demeanor vanished. "You questioning me, McNeil?" McNeil hesitated, then shook his head. "No. Just saying." Randall's eyes narrowed. "Good. Because I don't need anyone softening up on me now. We did what we had to do." At home, Olivia scrolled through social media, her heart sinking as she read post after post about Jamal's arrest. Videos from the raid showed frightened faces and chaos, contrasting sharply with the confident image her father projected. She bit her lip, a growing sense of unease settling over her. Back at the precinct, a young rookie officer named Davis was filing paperwork when he stumbled across an internal memo related to the raid. It mentioned inconsistencies in the chain of evidence. Davis hesitated, staring at the document, then quickly tucked it back into the folder. The weight of what he had seen gnawed at him, but he wasn't sure who he could trust. The following day, as the protests outside the courthouse grew louder, Thompson began his review of the case in earnest. He requested additional evidence, calling for surveillance footage and detailed police logs from the raid. His insistence on thoroughness raised eyebrows among court staff, some of whom whispered about his motives. In a private conversation with Cynthia that evening, Thompson confided, "This case feels wrong. The evidence doesn't add up, and the timing is too convenient." Cynthia, ever his anchor, placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "Trust your instincts, Elijah. They've never led you astray." As the city simmered with tension, a rookie officer slipped an anonymous note under Judge Thompson's chamber door. It read, "Evidence was planted. Look closer." Thompson stared at the note for a long moment, the words echoing in his mind. In that instant, he knew this case was more than just a trial. It was a battle for truth in a system designed to bury it. The courtroom was filled to capacity as Jamal's trial began. The atmosphere was heavy, a mix of anger, fear, and curiosity. On one side of the gallery sat Jamal's family, friends, and supporters, their presence a quiet but determined show of solidarity. On the other, police officers in uniform, including Randall, filled the rows, their faces stoic, their posture rigid. At the center of it all was Judge Thompson, his black robe flowing as he took his seat, his expression calm but firm. As the prosecution opened their case, they painted Jamal as a community leader with a dark side, a man who used his influence to mask his criminal activities. "The evidence will show," the prosecutor declared, "that the defendant not only possessed illegal substances but operated under the guise of legitimacy to evade law enforcement." The words were sharp, calculated to sway the jury, and Judge Thompson couldn't help but notice how Randall, sitting in the back, nodded in approval. Jamal's defense attorney, a young but skilled lawyer named Monica Wells, rose for her opening statement. She described Jamal as a passionate leader who dedicated his life to bettering his community. This case, she argued, isn't just about Jamal Harris. It's about a system that seeks to silence voices like his. Her words struck a chord with the gallery, and murmurs rippled through the crowd. The prosecution called Randall to the stand as their first witness. Dressed in his formal uniform, he exuded authority and confidence. Under questioning, he described the raid with precise detail, recounting how the drugs were discovered in Jamal's backpack. His tone was steady, his words measured, but Judge Thompson watched him closely, noting the faint trace of arrogance in his demeanor. Monica's cross-examination was sharp and unrelenting. She pressed Randall on the chain of custody for the evidence, pointing out gaps in the documentation. "Officer Randall," she asked, "is it standard procedure to transport evidence without logging it immediately?" Randall stiffened, his eyes narrowing. "It was a chaotic situation," he replied. "We followed protocol as best we could." Monica didn't let up. "So, you're saying there was a lapse in protocol?" Randall's jaw tightened, but he didn't answer directly, instead reiterating his confidence in the raid. The courtroom buzzed with whispers, and Judge Thompson's gavel came down sharply. "Order in the court," he said, his voice cutting through the noise. During a recess, Randall stepped into the hallway, his composure slipping. He glared at Monica as she walked past, muttering under his breath, "You're playing a dangerous game." Monica ignored him, her focus unwavering. Back inside, Judge Thompson reviewed the surveillance footage from the raid. The footage was grainy, but clear enough to show the chaos as officers stormed the community center. Thompson paused the video at a critical moment, his eyes narrowing as he spotted something. An officer slipping a small bag into Jamal's backpack. He rewound and played the clip again, his heart sinking as the realization dawned. That evening, Thompson returned home with the footage heavy on his mind. He shared his discovery with Cynthia, who listened intently. "If you expose this," she said carefully, "you're going to make enemies. Powerful ones." Elijah nodded. "I took an oath to uphold the law. That includes calling out those who break it, no matter who they are." Meanwhile, the community outside the courthouse had grown restless. Protesters chanted through megaphones, their voices echoing off the courthouse walls. Martha Harris stood at the forefront, her voice hoarse but resolute. "My son is innocent," she cried, "and we will not stop until the truth comes out." Inside the precinct, a storm was brewing. McNeil confronted Randall in the locker room, his voice low but firm. "You crossed a line, Randall. Planting evidence? That's not justice." Randall sneered. You don't know what you're talking about. I know what I saw, McNeil shot back. And I'm not the only one. Randall grabbed McNeil by the collar, his face inches away. You're going to keep your mouth shut, or you'll regret it. McNeil yanked himself free, his eyes blazing. You're not untouchable, Randall. Remember that. In the courthouse, Thompson received an anonymous tip that corroborated the footage he'd reviewed. The note was slipped under his door, much like the first one, and it detailed discrepancies in the evidence log. It was signed simply, Davis. Thompson summoned Monica to his chambers and shared the footage and the note. This might be the break we need, he told her. But we have to be careful. If this gets out too soon, it could jeopardize the case. Monica nodded, her expression grim. We'll handle it. But this is just the beginning, isn't it? Thompson leaned back in his chair, exhaustion etched into his features. It's always just the beginning. The next day in court, Monica introduced the surveillance footage as evidence. The prosecutor objected vehemently, but Thompson allowed it. The gallery watched in stunned silence as the clip played, showing the damning moment when an officer planted the drugs. Jamal's supporters erupted into cheers, while the police contingent shifted uneasily in their seats. Randall sat frozen, his face pale. For the first time, his confidence wavered. The cracks in his armor were starting to show, and the world was watching. The courtroom felt like a pressure cooker as the surveillance footage played on the screen. The grainy video depicted chaos during the raid, officers shouting and moving quickly. But the moment everyone was waiting for came into sharp focus. There, on the screen, an officer discreetly slipped a small plastic bag into Jamal's backpack. The gallery gasped collectively. Some leaned forward to get a better look. Others exchanged shocked glances. Martha Harris covered her mouth with her hands, tears welling in her eyes. Judge Thompson's gavel struck the bench, commanding silence. "Order in the court," he said sternly, but his voice carried an undertone of controlled anger. The footage was damning, but it wasn't enough. Not yet. The prosecutor rose quickly, attempting damage control. "Your Honor, this video is incomplete. It doesn't provide context." Monica Wells interrupted, standing with a confidence that filled the room. "Your Honor, the video shows an officer planting evidence. Context won't change that fact." The tension in the room crackled as the jury scribbled notes, clearly affected by what they had seen. Randall, seated at the back, gripped the edge of the bench so tightly his knuckles turned white. His mind raced, trying to calculate his next move. During the lunch recess, Thompson called a private meeting with Monica and the prosecutor in his chambers. "The footage raises serious questions about the integrity of this case," Thompson began, fixing both lawyers with a steady gaze. "I need both sides to cooperate in determining how this happened." The prosecutor bristled. "This is an attempt to derail a case based on a single officer's mistake. A mistake that could ruin an innocent man's life," Monica shot back. "And it wasn't just a mistake. It was deliberate." Thompson raised his hand, silencing them. "Enough. This court seeks justice, not theatrics. I expect full transparency moving forward." Meanwhile, in the police precinct, the fallout from the footage began to ripple through the ranks. Rookie Officer Davis, who had been silently grappling with his conscience, found himself at the center of growing suspicion. Randall cornered him in the locker room, his voice low and menacing. "You've been awfully quiet lately, Davis," Randall said, his tone a thinly veiled threat. "Anything you want to share?" Davis met Randall's gaze, his stomach churning. "Nothing, sir." Randall leaned in closer. "Good. Because if I find out you've been talking to anyone, well, let's just say you'll regret it." Davis nodded, swallowing hard. But as Randall left, the rookie clenched his fists. He couldn't stay silent forever. That evening, as the protests outside the courthouse grew louder, Davis made a decision. He contacted Monica Wells anonymously, arranging to meet in a quiet diner on the edge of town. Nervously, he slid into a booth, his baseball cap pulled low over his face. Monica arrived minutes later, her expression wary but curious. "I don't have much time," Davis said, glancing around nervously. "But you need to know the truth. Randall, he's been doing this for years. Framing people, planting evidence. Jamal isn't the first. Monica leaned forward, her voice urgent but calm. Do you have proof? Davis hesitated, then pulled out a USB drive. There's a lot. It's not everything, but it's enough to show a pattern. Monica took the drive, her heart pounding. This could change everything. As the trial resumed the next day, Monica presented the new evidence. The USB drive contained internal memos and reports that highlighted multiple cases where evidence collected by Randall had been called into question. Some cases had been quietly dropped. Others had resulted in convictions that now seemed deeply suspect. Randall was called back to the stand, his earlier confidence now replaced with visible discomfort. Monica's questions were relentless. "Officer Randall," she began, "how do you explain the discrepancies in these reports?" Randall shifted in his seat. "I don't know anything about those reports." Monica held up one of the memos. "This one has your name on it. Are you saying this was falsified?" Randall's jaw tightened. "I'm saying mistakes happen, but that doesn't mean I'm corrupt." "Perhaps not," Monica said, her voice cutting, "but it does mean your credibility is questionable. And in a case like this, credibility is everything." The courtroom buzzed as the weight of Monica's words sank in. Randall's composure cracked further when the prosecutor, trying to distance the state's case from the growing scandal, began questioning him as well. For the first time, Randall was on the defensive, and it was clear to everyone that the ground beneath him was crumbling. Outside the courthouse, the protests swelled. Activists held signs that read, "Free Jamal," and "Justice for all." Media outlets covered the case extensively, and public opinion began to shift. Randall's face appeared on the evening news, not as a hero but as a man under scrutiny. Judge Thompson watched the news coverage from his chambers, his expression grim. He knew the implications of the trial extended far beyond Jamal's case. This was about systemic corruption, about a community demanding accountability, and about his own role in ensuring justice prevailed. As the day ended, Thompson made a decision. He called Maria into his chambers. "Tomorrow," he said, "we're going to dig deeper. I want every officer involved in that raid to be questioned. No exceptions." Maria nodded, sensing the gravity of his words. "Understood, Your Honor." That night, Randall sat alone in his car outside the precinct, his mind racing. He had always believed the system would protect him, that his badge and reputation would shield him from consequences. But now, for the first time, he felt vulnerable, and that terrified him. In the distance, the sound of protesters echoed, their voices growing louder with each passing hour. The tide was turning, and Randall knew it. What he didn't know was whether he could stop it, or whether it would destroy him entirely. The morning sun cast long shadows over the courthouse steps, where protesters had camped overnight. Their chants carried through the crisp air, a mix of anger and hope. Inside the courthouse, the tension was palpable as the trial resumed. Every seat in the gallery was filled, and the press packed the back of the room, cameras ready to capture every moment. Judge Thompson entered the courtroom, his presence commanding silence. He glanced at the gallery, noting the diversity of faces, some filled with anger, others with quiet resolve. His gaze shifted to Randall, seated with his lawyer, his face stony but his eyes betraying unease. The prosecution attempted to regain control of the narrative, but their case was faltering under the weight of the mounting evidence against Randall. They called Officer McNeil to the stand, hoping to salvage credibility by focusing on the raid itself. McNeil, however, was no longer willing to toe the line. His conscience had been gnawing at him ever since the raid. As McNeil took the stand, Monica Wells seized the opportunity during cross-examination. Her tone was measured but firm. "Officer McNeil, can you confirm whether you witnessed any irregularities during the raid?" McNeil hesitated, his eyes darting to Randall, who glared at him from across the courtroom. Finally, he exhaled and said, "Yes. I saw Officer Randall place the bag of drugs in Mr. Harris's backpack." A gasp rippled through the courtroom. The prosecutor immediately objected, but the damage was done. Judge Thompson allowed McNeil to continue. "I knew it was wrong," McNeil admitted, his voice shaking, "but I didn't speak up because I was scared of what would happen to me." Randall's lawyer scrambled to discredit McNeil, painting him as a disgruntled subordinate. But the gallery's murmurs grew louder, and even the jury seemed unsettled by the revelation. Meanwhile, Monica introduced the USB drive provided by Officer Davis. The digital evidence exposed a pattern of misconduct by Randall in multiple cases. Internal memos revealed tampered evidence, coerced confessions, and a culture of silence within the precinct. The prosecutor looked visibly shaken, realizing the state's case was unraveling. As the court recessed for lunch, Randall cornered Davis in the hallway. "You little rat," he hissed, grabbing Davis by the arm. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Davis wrenched his arm free, his voice trembling but resolute. "I did what's right. Something you should have done a long time ago." Randall's mask of control slipped further, and for the first time, he looked genuinely afraid. Back in the courtroom, Monica called Randall to the stand. He reluctantly took his seat, his polished uniform unable to mask the sweat forming on his brow. Monica wasted no time. Her questions were surgical, each one aimed at exposing his lies. "Officer Randall," she began, holding up a report from a previous case. "Can you explain why evidence in this case was signed into the logged hours after it was allegedly discovered?" Randall's jaw tightened. It was an oversight. Monica's eyes narrowed. "An oversight or a deliberate attempt to cover your tracks?" Randall's lawyer objected, but Judge Thompson overruled it, allowing Monica to continue. She pulled out another document. "And in this case, why was key evidence mysteriously lost after the defendant claimed it had been planted?" Randall squirmed in his seat. "I don't recall the specifics." Monica pressed further. "Do you recall planting drugs in Mr. Harris's backpack during the raid?" Randall's face reddened. "No, that's absurd." Monica leaned closer. "Then how do you explain the surveillance footage? The testimony of your own colleague? The evidence from multiple cases that shows a pattern of misconduct?" The courtroom was silent, the weight of her words hanging heavily in the air. Randall's silence spoke volumes. His lawyer attempted to object, but the damage was done. The jury watched Randall with suspicion, his earlier confidence now completely eroded. As the day wore on, Judge Thompson addressed the court. "The evidence presented raises serious concerns not only about this case but about systemic issues within law enforcement. This court will reconvene tomorrow to allow further review of these matters." Outside the courthouse, the protests reached a fever pitch. Activists cheered as news of the day's revelation spread. Jamal's mother, Martha, addressed the crowd through a megaphone, her voice strong and defiant. "The truth is coming out. We will not be silenced." Randall, however, faced a very different scene. As he left the courthouse, he was met with reporters shouting questions and protesters hurling accusations. He pushed through the crowd, his once pristine image now in tatters. That night, in the solitude of his home, Randall poured himself a drink, staring at the television as news anchors dissected his fall from grace. He threw the glass against the wall, the shatter echoing through the empty room. For the first time, he felt the full weight of his actions and the inevitability of their consequences. Meanwhile, Judge Thompson sat in his chambers, reflecting on the day's events. He knew the trial was far from over, but he also knew a turning point had been reached. The system that had long protected people like Randall was beginning to crack, and he was determined to see it through to the end. As the clock struck midnight, the city seemed to hold its breath, poised on the brink of change. Justice was no longer just a possibility, it was becoming a reality. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation the next morning as the trial resumed. Word had spread of the previous day's explosive revelations, and the gallery was even more packed than before. Reporters jockeyed for space in the back, their notepads and cameras ready to capture the next twist. Outside, the protest had grown larger and louder, spilling into nearby streets. Signs reading "Accountability for All" and "Randall must pay" waved in the air as chants echoed through the city. Inside, Judge Thompson entered the courtroom with his usual steady demeanor, though the weight of the case bore visibly on his shoulders. As he took his seat, he glanced at the jury, who appeared equally tense. The day's proceedings promised to dig even deeper into the truth. The first witness called to the stand was Officer Davis, the rookie who had anonymously provided the damning USB drive. He approached the witness stand nervously, his hands shaking slightly as he took the oath. Davis was younger than most expected, barely out of his 20s, with an earnestness that made him seem both vulnerable and determined. Monica Wells began her questioning with a calm, reassuring tone. "Officer Davis, thank you for coming forward. Can you tell the court what you witnessed during the raid at the community center?" Davis took a deep breath. "I saw Officer Randall plant the drugs in Mr. Harris's backpack." The gallery erupted in whispers, and Judge Thompson banged his gavel. "Order in the court." Monica nodded encouragingly at Davis. "Please continue." Davis explained, his voice steadying as he spoke, how Randall had orchestrated the raid to target Jamal specifically. "He said we needed to teach him a lesson," Davis recounted, "that he was stirring up too much trouble." Monica's questions shifted to the broader culture within the precinct. Was this an isolated incident, or was there a pattern of this kind of behavior? Davis hesitated, clearly nervous about implicating his colleagues. Finally, he said, "It wasn't isolated. Randall, he did this before, and nobody stopped him." As Davis spoke, Randall's face turned red with anger. His lawyer leaned over, whispering furiously, but Randall brushed him off. The weight of Davis's testimony was unmistakable. It wasn't just about Jamal anymore. It was about exposing a corrupt system. During cross-examination, the prosecutor attempted to undermine Davis's credibility. "Officer Davis, you're a rookie, correct? Isn't it possible you misunderstood what you saw?" Davis shook his head firmly. "No, I know what I saw." The prosecutor pressed on. "And yet, you didn't report it at the time. Why not?" Davis hesitated. "Because I was scared. Randall has a lot of power in the precinct. People who cross him, they don't last." The jury's expressions reflected the weight of his words. Fear of retribution was a powerful explanation, one that resonated deeply in a case about systemic abuse. The next witness was Jamal Harris himself. The young activist entered the courtroom with a quiet dignity that commanded respect. As he took the stand, he looked directly at the jury, his expression calm but resolute. Monica began her questioning carefully. "Jamal, can you describe the events leading up to your arrest?" Jamal recounted the raid in vivid detail. "The sudden burst through the doors, the shouting, the panic. I was leading a meeting about our next food drive," he said. "The next thing I knew, I was on the ground, handcuffed, and being accused of crimes I didn't commit." When asked how the arrest had affected him, Jamal's voice wavered but didn't break. "It's not just about me. It's about everyone who's been targeted, everyone who's been silenced. They thought if they took me down, they could stop the movement. But they were wrong." The prosecutor attempted to cast doubt on Jamal's testimony, suggesting that his activism had put him in conflict with law enforcement. But Jamal's unwavering honesty and composure left little room for doubt. As the trial moved into the afternoon, Monica called a surprise witness, Officer McNeil. His earlier testimony had already shaken the courtroom, but this time, he was armed with more than just words. McNeil brought forward internal communications from the precinct, emails and text messages that revealed Randall's efforts to manipulate evidence and intimidate colleagues. One particularly damning message read, "We're not here to babysit. If we have to bend the rules to clean up the streets, so be it." Randall's lawyer objected vehemently, but Judge Thompson allowed the evidence. The gallery buzzed with shock as McNeil read the messages aloud. Each word was a nail in the coffin of Randall's defense. As the day wound down, Judge Thompson addressed the court. "This trial has uncovered deeply troubling issues, not only about this case but about the integrity of those sworn to uphold the law. This court will recess for the evening, but let it be clear, justice will not be deferred." Outside, the protest had transformed into a celebration. News of the day's revelations had spread quickly, and the mood among the crowd was one of cautious optimism. Martha Harris stood on the courthouse steps, tears streaming down her face as she addressed the crowd. "We're closer to the truth than we've ever been," she said. "But we're not done yet." Inside the courthouse, Randall sat alone in a side room, his head in his hands. His lawyer tried to reassure him, but it was clear the case was slipping away. For the first time, Randall felt the full weight of his actions pressing down on him. The power he had wielded for so long was now a double-edged sword, cutting back against him. That night, Judge Thompson returned home, exhausted but resolute. As he sat with his wife, Cynthia, he reflected on the day's events. "The truth is coming out," he said, "but the fight isn't over." Cynthia placed her hand on his. "It never is. But you're doing what's right, Elijah. That's all that matters." As the city settled into the night, the trial's impact reverberated far beyond the courtroom. Lives had been changed, systems had been challenged, and the foundation of justice itself was being redefined. But the battle was not yet won, and everyone knew the final verdict would be about much more than Jamal. It would be about the very soul of the community. The courtroom had become the epicenter of the city's focus, a stage where truths long buried beneath institutional power were being laid bare. The morning began with an air of unease, as though everyone inside could feel the weight of what was about to happen. Outside, the protests had swelled to the thousands, a mix of supporters, activists, and curious onlookers. The signs were more defiant, the chants louder, but the tension in the crowd was unmistakable. Judge Thompson entered the courtroom, his face as calm as ever, but his eyes betrayed his growing determination. He knew this day would push everyone involved to their limits. His gavel struck the bench. "Court is now in session." Monica Wells wasted no time. She stood and announced her intention to call her final witness, Officer Randall himself. The room fell silent as Randall made his way to the stand, his steps heavy and deliberate. His face was a mask of stoicism, but his body language betrayed a simmering anger and fear. Randall's lawyer had warned him against testifying, but Randall insisted, believing he could talk his way out of the corner he had been backed into. Monica began her questioning with an unsettling calm, her voice steady but pointed. "Officer Randall," she began, "you've served in law enforcement for over 20 years, correct?" "That's right," he replied, his tone clipped. "And in that time, would you say you've always adhered to the law?" "Yes," Randall said firmly, though the jury's skeptical expressions didn't escape him. Monica walked slowly to the evidence table, picking up one of the internal memos introduced by Officer McNeil. She held it up for the jury. "This memo, dated 2 years ago, discusses discrepancies in evidence handling under your supervision. Can you explain that?" Randall's jaw tightened. "Those were clerical errors. Nothing more." Monica's voice sharpened. "Clerical errors that led to convictions? Clerical errors that destroyed lives?" Randall's lawyer objected, but Judge Thompson overruled it. "Answer the question." Randall hesitated, then repeated, "It was a mistake." Monica stepped closer, her eyes locked on his. "And the drugs found in Jamal Harris's backpack, were those also a mistake?" Randall bristled. "I followed protocol." "Protocol," Monica echoed, her tone dripping with skepticism. She gestured toward the screen where the surveillance footage had been displayed earlier. "Did protocol include planting evidence? Because the footage shows you doing exactly that." Randall's mask cracked. "You don't know what it's like out there," he snapped. "The streets are dangerous, and sometimes you have to make hard choices." The courtroom buzzed with murmurs, and Judge Thompson banged his gavel. "Order." Monica pressed on, her voice rising. "So, you admit to planting evidence?" "I admit to doing what needed to be done," Randall shouted, his frustration boiling over. "People like Jamal think they're above the law, stirring up trouble, making it harder for the rest of us to do our jobs." The gallery erupted, half in outrage, half in shock. Randall's lawyer buried his face in his hands, knowing his client had just sealed his fate. Monica stepped back, letting his words hang in the air before turning to the jury. "No further questions, Your Honor." During the recess, the courtroom buzzed with energy. Reporters rushed to draft their breaking news updates, and activists outside cheered as word of Randall's outburst reached them. Inside, Randall sat in a corner, his lawyer berating him in hushed tones. Randall didn't respond. He just stared blankly at the wall, the weight of his crumbling career pressing down on him. When the court reconvened, the prosecution tried to regain control, but their case was beyond salvaging. The final blow came when Monica presented a report from the police department's Internal Affairs Division. which had opened an investigation into Randall's misconduct. The report, though preliminary, confirmed multiple allegations of evidence tampering, racial profiling, and abuse of power. The jury listened intently as Monica delivered her closing arguments. She spoke not just about Jamal Harris, but about the broader implications of the case. "This trial is about more than one man's innocence," she said. "It's about a system that allows corruption to flourish and targets the very people it's supposed to protect. The truth is now before you. The question is, what will you do with it?" The prosecutor's closing arguments were half-hearted, a feeble attempt to salvage a case that was already lost. By the time Judge Thompson dismissed the court for deliberation, the outcome felt inevitable. That night, the city was electric with anticipation. The protest continued, but there was a palpable shift in the air. Hope replacing despair. Martha Harris addressed the crowd again, her voice stronger than ever. "Tomorrow, we'll get the verdict. But tonight, let's remember what we're fighting for: justice, accountability, and a better future for all of us." Inside his modest home, Judge Thompson sat in his study, reflecting on the trial. Cynthia entered with a cup of tea and placed it on his desk. "You've done everything you can, Elijah," she said softly. "Now it's in their hands." Thompson nodded, though the weight of responsibility still pressed heavily on him. "This isn't just about the verdict," he said. "It's about what comes after. No matter what the jury decides, this is just the beginning." As the city settled into an uneasy quiet, Randall sat in his own home, the walls closing in around him. The life he had built, the power he had wielded so ruthlessly, was crumbling before his eyes. He poured himself another drink, but it brought no comfort. The faces of those he had wronged, people like Jamal, flashed through his mind. For the first time, he felt something unfamiliar: guilt. The morning of the verdict arrived, and the city was on edge. The courthouse was surrounded by a sea of protesters, journalists, and curious onlookers. Signs reading "Justice for Jamal" and "Accountability Now" waved in the crisp morning breeze, while chants echoed through the streets. The atmosphere was electric, a mix of hope and anxiety. Inside the courthouse, the tension was palpable. Jamal sat at the defense table, his face calm but his hands clasped tightly together. His mother, Martha, sat directly behind him, her presence a quiet source of strength. Monica Wells stood to his left, organizing her notes but glancing occasionally at the jury box, where 12 men and women prepared to deliver their decision. Judge Thompson entered the courtroom, his expression neutral but his movements deliberate. He sat down and looked out over the packed room. "This court is now in session," he said, his voice cutting through the tension. "Will the jury foreperson please rise?" A woman in her late 40s stood, holding a folded piece of paper in her hands. Her expression was serious, her eyes darting briefly to Jamal before settling on the judge. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge Thompson asked. "Yes, Your Honor," the woman replied. "Please deliver the verdict." The courtroom fell silent as the foreperson began to read. "In the case of the People versus Jamal Harris, we, the jury, find the defendant not guilty." The gallery erupted into cheers and applause, a tidal wave of relief and joy washing over Jamal's supporters. Martha broke into sobs, clutching her son tightly as Jamal turned to her, tears streaming down his face. Monica smiled, her composure cracking for just a moment as the weight of the months-long battle lifted. Judge Thompson banged his gavel. "Order! Order in the court!" Gradually, the room settled, though the energy remained electric. Thompson turned to Jamal. "Mr. Harris, you are free to go. This court finds no evidence to support the charges against you. You have been wronged, and I commend your courage in standing firm under these circumstances." The prosecutor stood, looking defeated. "Your Honor, we request a mistrial for procedural review." Monica cut him off, her voice sharp. "Your Honor, the jury has spoken. Any attempt to undermine this verdict is baseless and a further miscarriage of justice." Thompson nodded firmly. "The verdict stands. Court is adjourned." The gavel struck one last time, and the gallery erupted again, this time with a mix of cheers and hugs among Jamal's supporters. Reporters rushed out of the room, eager to break the news. Cameras outside captured the jubilant celebration as protesters cheered and hugged one another. The chant of "Justice for Jamal" became a roar that echoed through the city. As Jamal walked out of the courtroom surrounded by his family and supporters, reporters swarmed him. "Jamal, how does it feel to be free?" one asked. Jamal paused, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I'm grateful for the truth coming out. But this isn't just about me. This is about every person who's been silenced, every person who's been wrongfully accused. The fight isn't over. We still have work to do." Martha, standing beside him, nodded proudly. "My son stood up for what's right, and now it's time for all of us to do the same." Meanwhile, Randall exited the courthouse through a side door, his head low to avoid the cameras. His lawyer walked briskly beside him, but the officer who once exuded confidence was now a shadow of his former self. The media had turned against him, headlines branding him as the face of police corruption. Inside the precinct, Randall faced a meeting with Internal Affairs. The investigation into his conduct was moving forward, bolstered by the evidence from the trial. Officers who had once supported him now avoided his gaze. The walls of protection that had shielded him for years were gone. "Randall," the IA investigator said coldly, "you'll be placed on administrative leave effective immediately. A formal inquiry into your actions is underway." Randall nodded silently, knowing there was no escaping what was coming. He left the precinct, the weight of his downfall pressing down on him. The day after the verdict, the city buzzed with renewed energy. Jamal, now free man, held a press conference at the community center where he had been arrested months earlier. The center was packed with supporters, activists, and community leaders. Jamal stood at the podium, his voice steady and strong. "We won this battle," he said, "but the fight for justice continues. This is about more than one case. It's about rebuilding trust, holding those in power accountable, and creating a system that serves everyone equally." The crowd erupted in applause, and Jamal's words carried beyond the room, amplified by the media coverage. Across the city, people felt a shift, a crack in the foundation of corruption that had long seemed unbreakable. As Jamal stepped down from the podium, he was greeted by his mother and Monica Wells. "You did it," Monica said, smiling. "No," Jamal replied. "We did it." The city wasn't perfect, and the road ahead was long. But for the first time, the people felt that justice was within reach. And for Randall, sitting alone in his dimly lit home, the sound of those chants was a haunting reminder of the reckoning he had tried and failed to avoid.